Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.
Hi, hello, vanakkam and welcome to Little Sly YouTube channel. And this is me, your Vasant Shanmugam. So in this video on our SQL tutorial series, we are going to see about constraints. So what is a constraint? So a constraint is a restriction that is placed on one or more columns of a table through which we limit the type of values that we store in the column. And this constraint provides a standard mechanism to maintain the accuracy and integrity of the data inside the database table. And for this, we have 6 types of constraints. We have several types, but out of which we will discuss about the most important 6 types of constraints, which is the not null, and then the primary key. The third one is unique. The fourth one is default. The fifth one is foreign key, and the sixth one is check. So let's discuss each of these constraints with examples. So the first one is not null. So not null is the first constraint that we are going to check. So in this SQL screen, so we use double hyphen as the comment. So you can use this as a comment whenever you want to enter or whenever you want to make something to understand. So you can create this as a comment. So let's see how to use this not null constraint and what is the main objective of this not null constraint. So this not null constraint specifies that the column does not accept null values. Even when we create a table in our previous video, we saw that we create table with values, but that column does not accept null values. So this means if not null constraint is applied on a column, then we cannot insert a new row in the table without adding a non-null value for that column. So let's create a table with a SQL statement. And the name is going to be, the name of the table is going to be persons, which has 4 columns, which we have already used. And out of which 3 columns, which is the user ID, the name, and the phone number do not accept null values. So let's create a table with this not null constraints. And before that, let us drop the table which I already have, which is create account. Let me run this. So we have deleted this table. So let's start another new table, which is create table and create account. So the first one is user ID, and this is going to be the data type of int, and which is not null. The second is going to be name, which is a varchar with 50 as the length of it, and then not null. And the third one is going to be the date of birth, which is a date in data type. And then comes the phone number, which is again a varchar of 50, which is a not null. So out of these 4 values, we have user ID as not null, the name as not null, the date of birth as null. So we can enter, or we do not want the date of birth to be entered. But the all other 3 values, that is the user ID, the name, and the phone number, has to be not null. So is 0, the value 0 is same as null? No. So a null is different from 0 or blank or a 0 length character string, such as double quote, so without any value. So null means there is no entry has been made. It should not be like as entering as 0 is not null. So it has some values in it. So entering a 0 length character or entering as something like a empty space. So is that null? No, it's not null. So a null is which means a null means there will be no entry made to that value. So this is our table that we use to create account. So here we have not null for the 3 columns in our table. And let's now move to the primary key constraint. So what is the primary key constraint? So second one, which is the primary key constraint. And here we are going to create the same table but with different column. So the first one is going to be user ID, which is again an integer value, which is not null. But this user ID is going to be the primary key. So just entering primary key after the data type or after the not null will make sure it is a primary key. And the second one is the name, which is a var character 30, and this is again a not null. And then comes the date of birth, DOB, which is a date. And finally comes the phone number, which is again a var character of 30, or even we can give it as 15, which includes the extension. Then this is going to be not null. So this will create the table with the values. Let's drop the table before we create this again. So now let's move on to the third constraint, which is the unique constraint. So the third one is unique constraint. And here the unique constraint restricts one or more columns to contain unique values within a table. So although both a unique constraint and a primary key constraint enforces uniqueness, using a unique constraint instead of a primary key constraint when you want to enforce the uniqueness of a column or combination of columns, that is not the primary key. So let's try this with an example here. So what I'm going to create is I'm going to create a table, customer details. And this contains the ID, which is the user ID, which is not null again. And this is going to be the primary key. And next comes the name, which is a varchar. And this is going to be a 30 length. Then this is not null. Next comes the date of birth, which is a data type. And now comes the phone, which is the varchar of 15. And this is again not null, but this will be unique. Say for example, if we are entering the same phone number to create an account 2 times with the same phone number, it will not be allowed. So this is again a unique value. So when these multiple unique constraints can be defined on a table, whereas only one primary key constraint can be defined on a table. So here you can see we have one primary key, but at the same time, we can have multiple unique keys in a table. So let's try that. So for now, let's have user ID as the primary key, and then let's give the name also as a primary key, and let's try to create a table. So here we could get an error message that the customer details table has more than one primary key. What if we have this name value as unique, and let's run this SQL. And here we can see that the SQL query is successfully executed and the table is again created, but with 2 unique keys. So here we have clearly seen that we cannot have 2 primary keys in the same table, but we can have multiple unique keys in the same table, which is we can have more than one unique key in the table. So let's delete that table now and we'll use it for the next one. So now let's move to the next constraint, which is the default constraint. And this default constraint specifies the default value for the columns. What is the default value? So let's see. The column default is some value that will be inserted in the column by the database engine when an insert statement does not explicitly assign a particular value. So every time when we insert any value into the table, we use the insert statement to insert the value into the table. But this default column is some value that will be inserted in the column by the database engine, and it is not by us or by the database administrator or any other user. It is automatically inserted by the database engine. Just underline it's the database engine. So let's have the statement here. So the fourth one is going to be default constraint. Let's create the table here. So let's create a table default user. Let's create the column names. So for now, let's start with user ID, which is integer data type, and it is going to be not null. And this is again a primary key. And next comes the name, which is a varchar of 30 length, and it is again not null. Next comes the date of birth, which is date format, data type. Next comes the phone number, which is varchar of 15, which is not null, again, which is unique. And finally, we have the country, which is a varchar of 30, which is again not null, but we have mentioned default as United Kingdom for this example. So since we mentioned United Kingdom as default, so for every user we create, this United Kingdom comes as a default value. So let's create this and see how does it works. So here we could see the table has got created. So when we enter any value, automatically the database engine will insert the country value in the column. So now let's see one more important thing, which is if we define a table column as not null, but assign the column a default value, something like this. So this is a not null, but again, it's a default value. So then in the insert statement, so when we insert the values, we don't need to explicitly assign a value for that column in order to insert a new row in the table. So every time when we insert a value, we just it's enough to enter the user ID, name, date of birth, and phone number. So automatically the country will be populated. It's not the country, it's the not null and the default value, which will be inserted or which will assign the database engine will assign this value every time to that column. So that is again the uniqueness of this default constraint. And let's now move to the fifth one, which is the foreign key constraint. So a foreign key, which we normally call as FK, is a column or combination of columns, and that we use to establish and enforce a relationship between the data in two tables. And we say, for example, if we have two tables, one is the department and the next one is employees. A department will have a department ID and the department name. At the same time, an employee who works for that department and he has his own personal details, something like his employee ID, his employee name, and finally his department ID. So he works for a department and the department has a department ID. So this primary key in the department is a foreign key for the employee. Okay, so let's now see that with the example. So here we have two tables, which is department. So let's create a table with department. And the first table is department, and here we create department ID, and this is going to be int, not null, and this is the primary key here. And next comes the department name, so which department he works, and that is a character of 50. And let's create this table. So when we want to comment multiple lines, we can use this star, the asterisk, and then the slash, the forward slash, which will help us to comment multiple lines. So let's create this table now. So we have created a table which has the department. And then let's create the table employee. And let's create the columns for this user. And it starts with employee ID, which is an integer value and it is not null. And this is the primary key for this particular table. So here we can see for this table, which is the department table, we have department ID as the primary key, and for table employee, we have employee ID as the primary key. And then we have this employee name, which is a varchar of 55, which is not null. And next comes the hiring date. So when did he get hired to the organization? And that is a date, and it has to be not null. And next comes the salary, which is an integer. Next comes the department ID. If you remember, this department ID is the primary key in our department table. And then let us define this, which is we give this as foreign key, where the department ID is going to be the foreign key, which references the department table, and it is department ID there. And this is how we create the foreign key and we reference it. So far what we did is we created a table department with department ID as the primary key and department name as the varchar, and then we are going to create another table. Let us comment this. So now we are creating another table, which is the employee, where we have the employee ID as not null, and we have the employee name, we have hire date, we have salary, department ID as the last column, which is the primary key for the department table, but it is a foreign key, which we are referencing it with the foreign key here with this department ID to the department tables department ID. And let's create this table and see how does it works. So here again we have created. So we have created, and again we have referenced it as well. So let's now move on to the final constraint, which is the check constraint. Sixth constraint, which is the check constraint. Well, what is a check constraint? So this check constraint is used to restrict the values that can be placed in a column. So what is that? How can we restrict a value that can be placed in a column? So let's see that with an example. So for an example, let's see the range of values of a salary column that can be limited by creating a check constraint that allows values only between 3,000 to 10,000. Say for example, if particular department employees has a salary range between 3,000 to 10,000, or the maximum is going to be 20,000. So this prevents the salaries from being entered beyond the regular salary range. So that is how the check constraint helps us, or it is being used in this particular column. So let's create a table. So this is going to be check salary, and let's create the fields, the columns. So we have employee ID, which is again an int, not null, the primary key. So in this table, we have created multiple columns. So it starts with the employee ID, and which is an integer data type. And then we have the not null and the primary key. Next, we have the employee name with the data type varchar, and then it is going to be not null. And as we see, we cannot have multiple primary keys in a table. So the employee ID is the primary key, and every other values is just a column value. We can make it as unique, but not as a primary key. And then we have this hiring date, and we have the salary here, which is again the data type is int, and then it is going to be not null, but we have this check constraint set up here, which is the salary can be greater than 3,000, but it should be less than 10,000. So that we can clearly declare it when we create the table. And then we have the department ID, and finally the foreign key, where we can reference the current table's department ID with the primary key of the department table. And let's create this query and let's see how does it work. References, I'm really sorry, so this has to be references and not reference. There is one more error. So check salary is already created. Check salary dupe. Okay, so here we have check salary created already, and we have check salary dupe. So this is how we use the constraints. So here we have used these constraints now, and in our next video, what we will do is we will enter the values, we will insert the values into each of these tables, each of these constraints, and let's see how does it work. Until we meet you in another interesting video, it's bye-bye from Vasant Shanmugam and Little's Law.